Great are you, O Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense, and your wisdom beyond reckoning. And so we humans, who are a due part of your creation, long to praise you. We who carry our mortality about with us, carry the evidence of our sin, and with it the proof that you thwart the proud. Yet these humans, due part of your creation as they are, still do long to praise you. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself, and our heart is unquiet until it rests in you. Grant me to know and understand, Lord, which comes first, to call upon you or to praise you, to know you or to call upon you. Must we know you before we call upon you? Anyone who invokes what is still unknown may be making a mistake. Or should you be invoked first, so that we may then come to know you? But how can people call upon someone in whom they do not yet believe? And how can they believe without a preacher? But Scripture tells us that those who seek the Lord will praise him. For as they seek, they find him, and on finding him, they will praise him. Let me seek you, then, Lord, even while I am calling upon you, and call upon you even as I believe in you. For to us you have indeed been preached. My faith calls upon you, Lord, this faith which is your gift to me, which you have breathed into me through the humanity of your Son and the ministry of your preacher. As many of you probably know, that quotation comes from St. Augustine's book, The Confessions. It's the opening prayer where Augustine lays out really his ultimate goal and desire for that book, and really I think you could argue for his life and work as a whole. And I chose it as a way to start our course because really it captures what I hope ultimately this class will in a small way do for all of us, that it will enable us to better know God, and therefore by better knowing God, better understanding God and his work in the world, we'll be in a better position to pray to him, in a better position to live out our faith. And that's really the goal of this class, and for many of you that's going to be the goal of the broader program in studying graduate theology here at Newman University. And so I thought it was a fitting quotation to begin with there from Augustine. And as he, of course, very famously says, the little snippet in the midst of that prayer that gets quoted most often, that we are made for God and our hearts are restless until they rest in him, that we're all seeking in some way kind of that ultimate happiness, that ultimate rest and peace. As we'll talk about later in the course, Aquinas focuses on this a great deal. He talks about how everything we do is ultimately seeking a true happiness that we as Christians believe is going to ultimately come about by a perfect personal union with God. That is our ultimate goal in everything we do, including, of course, our study, but also more broadly living out our faith. And the ultimate purpose of this course and the program is to assist in that in some small way. And as we're going to see as we go through this class, Christian theology really develops in the midst of that pursuit, both by the individual theologians who are aiming to get closer to God, but more broadly through church history over time as God's people come to a better and better understanding of who God is and what his work in this world is and what it's meant to do. And over time we grow in our understanding and hopefully therefore grow closer to God. And the discipline of theology, which we're all doing here in this class, is meant to be a part of that, right? It's meant to be something that takes place within this broader context of the lived faith of the individual who's studying or doing theology, and then also within the broader context of the life of the church, where God's people as a whole are working through time, through history, to live out God's plan for us so that ultimately reach that final happiness. And theology, as we're going to see, really comes into existence in the midst of that process, right? It's a discipline that's designed to and comes into existence in the midst of this historical living context of the church and individual Christian lives. Right now, for many of you, and for many people, we don't think of theology that way. Theology in our day has become a distinct academic discipline, right? That theology is another subject that we study. So particularly if you go to, say, a Catholic college for your undergraduate degree, you're going to study, geography and biology and math and theology, right? And it's one of these disciplines where we have a particular set of knowledge, a particular set of ideas that we're going to master for this discipline, and it just kind of fits into this overall educational program. And of course, obviously, in some ways, theology does function that way in the life of the modern university. But of course, what has happened over the centuries as theology has grown and developed and universities have become what they are today, for many people there has been a real disconnect between theology as a discipline and the life of the church or the life of the individual believer. And it's, of course, as we probably all know, not just a question of it being disconnected, right? There are, in fact, many people who would see the discipline of theology as contrary to or an impediment to a real faithful life as a Christian or to the real good of the church. And to be fair, there are many theologians who have practiced their discipline, who practice theology in a way where it really sets up a conflict between living a good, faithful Christian life, or a conflict between theologians and the discipline and the church, and particularly the church hierarchy, but the church more broadly as well. And what we are trying to do in this program is to reverse that, right? To really bring these two things together so that we're studying theology in the context, in the way that it came into existence, right? Where it is part of an integrated Christian life, part of the life of the church, right? And so what I want to do is to try to introduce you to how that might work here in this first course by doing a little survey of church history and the discipline of theology, right? To throw out another famous quotation, we're probably all familiar with this idea that theology is faith-seeking understanding, and that when we are living here in 21st century America, we have all kinds of questions, right? All kinds of difficult problems that we as Christians have to face in the world around us. There are certainly lots of criticisms of our faith, from the new atheists, those intellectuals who kind of actively combat and question Christianity in our world today. There are questions raised by science. There are questions raised by political developments of our day. There are all kinds of difficulties that we face in trying to think about how our faith relates to the world around us and how we ought to relate to the world around us as people of faith. And the fact that we have this disconnect between theology and the life of Christians and the life of the church makes all of that much harder. So what we need to do is to reintegrate these things, to live out a way of doing theology that is in fact going to equip us to face these real problems, these questions that we have today in America, and also allow us to reintegrate the study of theology with our faith so that they are mutually supporting, mutually beneficial. So this, of course, raises then the question of how is it that we're going to do this, right? Because we live in a world where there are so many voices, so many perspectives, right? And of course, as you're looking to enter into a course in Catholic theology or into a program in Catholic theology, you're no doubt aware that there are all kinds of different perspectives on this, right? That there are very different ways of thinking about how one should really do authentically Catholic theology in 21st century America. And there are schools with very different emphases, very different methods that we can all go to. And so, given all the different voices we have within the Catholic world, and more broadly, even more voices in 21st century American Christianity, and then even more broadly in our culture as a whole, what do we pick, right? How do we find a way of thinking about how our faith relates to the world, how we ought to understand our faith as educated 21st century American citizens? what approach should we take, and how can we choose between all these different methods and models out there? Well, what I would propose is that we ought to follow a model that I would say is advocated by Scripture, right? So as you're going to find out over the course of this class, and for many of you more broadly through the program, as I entered into the Catholic Church as a convert, I was raised in a Baptist church, and then ultimately entered into the Catholic Church in graduate school. And part of what I appreciate from my Protestant Baptist upbringing was a real immersion in the thought of St. Paul. So I love St. Paul. I think I often go to him when I'm looking for guidance on how to deal with different things. But one of the things that often comes to my mind when thinking about St. Paul is when he tells his early Christian readers that they ought to model him as he models Christ, right? And for us as Catholic Christians, we're very familiar with this idea in terms of the lives of the saints, right? That we look to the saints, we venerate the saints, because they can model a way of being like Christ for us, right? So that where it might be difficult for us to think about how am I like Christ, despite, whether or not we have one of the popular bracelets or bumper stickers with the WWJD, a lot of times it can be difficult to know what Jesus would do in a particular context. And so, of course, one of the ways that the saints function in the lives of Catholics, and some other Christians as well, is that they can give us different models for how we can be like Christ, right? That we can have the model of St. Francis gives us one way of being like Christ, and the model of, say, St. Joan of Arc gives us in many ways a very different way of being Christ-like. And so that when we're in different situations and different vocations in life, we can look to these different saints and model our lives on them, and they in turn, of course, are modeling Christ for us, right? And it can be a very useful thing. And of course we see this in the broader non-Christian world as well, that if you really want to learn a craft, if you want to learn a discipline, what do, right? Well, of course, as we know and as we can see here, right, well, one way is to go on YouTube and find some videos on how to do it. I've made a number of auto repairs and home repairs myself using that method. But of course, there's sometimes some mixed success with that, right? That watching YouTube for figuring out how to fix your vehicle sometimes is going to work great, sometimes it's not going to work so well. Right? We all know that there are limitations to just reading a book or watching a video or what have you. So if one really wants to learn, say, to be an auto mechanic, how do you do that? Well, I think we would all probably agree that the most effective way to do that is that you are going to go and learn, right? You're going to go and practice with people who are good. You're going to find a school where you can learn from and practice with real experienced, skilled mechanics. Or you're going to go work at an auto shop where you're going to work with mechanics who know the way things work and who can model for you the proper way to do things, right? And of course this has a tradition all through world history, that one apprentices, one learns from a master, and that is how you ultimately gain the ability to practice a particular craft or discipline. Now, of course, ultimately, right, one can in some ways move beyond their master, right, can bring in a unique perspective, right? Very famously, this happens in philosophy. Socrates is the model, the mentor for Plato, who comes along and follows much of what Socrates does, but also changes it and makes it his own in particular ways. And then in turn, Aristotle follows Plato and learns from him and learns how to be a philosopher, but develops a very different way of doing philosophy ultimately than Plato. But he learns through that process, through learning from his mentor, and then that enables him then to go on and be a master of the craft in his own right. So I would propose that we as people who are looking to understand, looking to practice theology, we ought to do the same sort of thing, that we ought to look to a master and find out how to do that, right? And so, of course, one of the challenges is there are lots of people out there who would claim to be the masters, right? So what I would propose to do in this opening course is to go back a little bit to people that we would all agree, or almost all, would agree, are true masters of what it is to do theology, to integrate faith and reason in a way that allows one to answer the problems and crises of one's day, and is able to integrate the practice of theology with the larger life of the church and with a faithful Christian life on their own. And so that's really the ultimate idea of this class, is we are going to look at some true models of how one does theology, right? How do we practice theology? Now again, even within the realm of just Catholic thought, Catholic figures, there are a whole host of people that we could look at as models of this. So for example, Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman would be a great example and a fitting one for our program, but I'm not going to look at him, at least not in this particular course, in a concentrated way. So what I would propose for us to look at is what I'm going to call the A-Team. Right? Why do I call them the A-Team? Well, in part because I'm the child of the 80s, and I just springs to mind this phrase of the A-Team, but there's no Mr. T involved in this one, of course, sadly. But I would say that we ought to look at three figures who have shaped the church in sort of fundamental ways, and have really, more than any other figures, defined Western Christianity, Western theology in important and fundamental ways. And so, as it happens, all three of them have names that begin with A. So we have Athanasius, Augustine, and Aquinas. And so those three figures are going to be our models for how it is that we ought to practice the discipline of theology. And I think looking at these three figures will be beneficial in a number of different ways, right? As I already said, these three figures, really more than any others in Christian tradition, have made theology what it is today, particularly for Western Christianity, as we'll talk about a little later. But more broadly, all three have impacted theology as a whole, really more than any other figures that we could point to. And all three of them show for us how to integrate one's faith with the intellectual and philosophical problems of one's time, how to deal with particular political and pragmatic problems, and how to remain faithful to tradition, to scripture, while still coming up with ways of answering new and unique and challenging problems. And so I think these three figures will give us a wonderful introduction into how we should do theology. And of course, in the process, by looking at these three figures, two of them from the early church, or what we call the patristic period, and then Aquinas from the medieval or scholastic period, by looking at these three figures, we're also going to get a very nice introduction to some of the key theological doctrines and themes that define our faith, and we're also going to be able to get an understanding of how theology develops and how theology as a discipline works and has evolved and grown over the centuries. And so that starting with these three pivotal figures is really going to be a good way of getting our feet wet and starting to deal with some of the big issues in theology. So now to get us started, what we're going to do, of course, as I said, we go through this course, we're going to look at these three figures, and we'll spend a good bit of time looking at each of them. But I want to give you just a general sense of who these figures are if you aren't really familiar with them, or maybe you're not familiar with all of them. So first of all, we're going to be looking at St. Athanasius. St. Athanasius is the one of the three figures we're going to be looking at who's considered more of an Eastern Christian, an Eastern theologian. So Athanasius wrote in Greek, unlike Augustine and Aquinas, who write and spoke in Latin. He's also the earliest of the three. So he lived and worked in the 4th century, that is in the 300s AD. Athanasius, as many of you might know, was a pivotal figure in the development of the Nicene Creed and Nicene Orthodoxy, right? So he's most famous for his role in that controversy, and there was this argument, as we'll talk about a good bit, in the 4th century about whether or not Jesus was fully divine in the same way that God the Father was divine. And so the creed that, as Catholics, that we say every Sunday and that many other Christians recite as well, the Nicene Creed, Athanasius plays a crucial role in bringing that about and in affirming that he is true God from true God, one in being with the Father. So Athanasius plays a pivotal role in helping the church reach that understanding and formulating that creed and then defending it. He's also important in a number of other ways. Athanasius, as we're going to look at, wrote one of the most important biographies in Christian history. He wrote The Life of Antony. So he wrote a very inspiring account of the life of Anthony, who was one of the first Christian monastics who lived in the desert and was an ascetic. And really, Athanasius' account of his life played a crucial role in the development and formation of Christian asceticism and Christian monastic tradition ever since. And so those two things in particular are going to be a real emphasis when we would look at St. Athanasius. He's also just a wonderful, colorful figure. When I entered the church in graduate school, I actually chose St. Athanasius as my confirmation name, and not because he's the most brilliant or the most subtle and intellectual of the church fathers. I chose him just because he has this wonderful personality, right? He just had this force that allowed him to persevere in his fight for what he believed about the nature of Jesus as being truly God, even when it seemed as if the entire world was fighting against him. And so I think he's just a wonderful, inspiring figure, and I think you're really going to enjoy getting to know him. And of the three, he's probably the one that many of you know the least about. So I'm really excited about talking about St. Athanasius with you. And also, as a little tidbit, he's also credited with one of the three creeds that is part of, or can be part of, Catholic liturgy. We're all familiar with the Nicene Creed, which we will talk about. We're probably familiar with the Apostles' Creed, but there's also the Athanasian Creed, which is one of the official creeds of the Catholic Church, even though, of course, it's not said nearly as often as the other two. But we'll be learning a lot more about Athanasius in the coming weeks. Our next figure that we'll look at after that is St. Augustine. And St. Augustine is just a towering figure in the practice of and the discipline of theology. Again, of the three, we could debate this on the weekend or whenever we get together if you'd like, or virtually. I would argue that Augustine probably has more influence than any other figure in Western Christianity if we were going to have to pick first place. He just writes on so many different topics and shapes Christian theology on so many different issues in a way that just changes everything that comes after him. So that really, if you want to understand Western theology, both Catholic and Protestant, you can't really do that unless you understand St. Augustine and what he's doing in his theological work. It just changes everything that comes after him. So in this class, we're going to be able to touch on some of it, but at least my aim is to give you enough of an introduction to St. Augustine that then in all of your time to come after this program, after this course, you'll be equipped to explore him in much more depth, because he deals with so many different things during the course of his career and the course of his life. So we'll be looking at his understanding of the sacraments and his understanding of how salvation works, which is really pivotal in the shaping of Western Christianity. One of some of the main controversies he deals with tie together this understanding of what is the Catholic understanding of the sacraments, and then how does that fit with our understanding of how one moves from being a sinner into a state of grace where one is ultimately going to be in heaven with God for eternity. But we'll also be looking at St. Augustine and some of the other things he does that are very influential even up to this day. So Augustine, even in his time, around the year 400, so he's a generation or so after Athanasius, but he's dealing with questions of how does one integrate faith with science or the study of the natural world. And his answer is still important for shaping how we should do that today. He writes a commentary on how we ought to, as Christians, understand the book of Genesis. Obviously going to be very timely for Christians in 21st century America. And of course, Augustine is also hugely influential in his understanding of marriage, sexuality, sexual ethics, and all of those things continue to have important consequences for Christians in today's world. So we're going to get an introduction to Augustine and his thought that I think will really be beneficial for you as you move forward in the program, and then also just understanding some of these key issues in the life of Christians up to this day. And then we're going to take a jump in our course from Athanasius in the mid-late 300s to Augustine in the late 300s, early 400s. Then we're going to jump about 800 years, and we're going to go to St. Thomas Aquinas, or just Thomas or Aquinas. He's one of the real rare figures where you can refer to him either by his first or last name, and just that. But Aquinas, in the time from Augustine, is clearly the most influential Catholic thinker that there is, right? And he really shapes the Catholic perspective on many things. If we didn't have a catechism that would give us a kind of sort of concise breakdown of the Church's position on all sorts of different issues, if that didn't exist, Aquinas would be a close replacement for that, really, because for almost any issue that you have questions about, if you go and find what does Aquinas say about this, and he has an answer for most every one of those issues that you're going to come up with, the answer that Aquinas gives is going to be the answer that the Church still teaches and holds up to this day. Now, there are some developments, and there are a few very rare exceptions, but for the most part, Aquinas really formulates the Catholic view on a whole host of topics within theology. And as we're going to talk about, one of the key things he does is that in 1200, or in the 1200s rather, Aquinas really gives a gift to the Church in taking all of the work that had been done in those centuries leading up to his time and synthesizing it, putting it into, very famously, his work, the Summa Theologica, the Sum of Theology, where he's able to integrate the Church Fathers, Scripture, tradition, and a whole host of other things into sort of a systematic account of the Catholic faith. And so we're going to get an introduction to that. You're going to learn how to use and read the Summa so that you can, again, continue to read and benefit from Aquinas long after you have taken this class. We're going to look at how Aquinas practices theology, this method that he develops for doing it, and looking at also some of the key areas where he really shapes Catholic thought in important ways, like the relationship between faith and reason, and in particular looking at his moral theology, which is still very much the moral theology of Catholic Christians and many other Christians up to this day. So that's kind of a really brief introduction to these three pivotal figures that we're going to be looking at. Many of you might have already known that, but for some of you, this may be new, and so hopefully that will be helpful in starting to get your bearings in what we're going to be doing in this class. Now, some of you might be a little concerned, a little apprehensive at this point, because tackling any one of these figures is a big undertaking. Trying to tackle three figures of this magnitude in one 8-week course is going to be challenging. And of course, these are figures who, even if we can see them kind of as our own, as part of our tradition, part of our team, so to speak, they wrote and did their work in other languages centuries and centuries ago. And so it can be a little daunting to think about how do we approach them, right? So now the problem is we could go out and find, again, any number of books looking at the Church Fathers, the Doctors of the Church, or any one of these in particular, these figures in particular, and we could find a whole host of different perspectives on them that we could take. And some of them are going to be contradictory. So again, how do we get started? Right, and so what I'm going to propose that we do in this class, and since I'm the teacher, I kind of get to choose what we do in the class to a certain extent, is what I want to do is to try to use as much as possible the figures themselves. So we're really going to focus on using the primary sources. We're going to read the works of Athanasius, read the works of Augustine, read the works of Aquinas, In translation, of course, although if any of you are fluent in Greek or Latin, your contributions to the discussion would be more than welcome. But we're going to be looking at English translations of these primary sources so that we can read Athanasius, Augustine, Aquinas in their own words and come to understand them. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to situate them, right? We're going to get an understanding of who these figures are, what the issues are, both through the lectures and then also through some limited readings from other works. But then really what I want to do is to look at and introduce you to these primary sources. So we're going to see how to find the primary sources. How do we find the works of Augustine? How do we find the works of Aquinas or Athanasius? And then how do you go about reading them? So we're going to walk through different pieces, very small samples from some of the pivotal works of these three figures so that you will be comfortable with and understand how to go back and read these figures and figures like them in their own words, right? So, and again, the goal is not for me to give you this education in Catholic theology, which is far beyond my ability, to be sure. Really, the goal is to just equip you to go out and read from the true masters in their own words. So that's really going to be our focus, is reading these primary texts. We're going to go through the different figures and through different key topics in each figure and read what they have to say, talk about it, talk about how they make their arguments and how they develop Christianity's understanding of all of these different issues. So that's really going to be our focus. Now, again, I do want to give you a little context for coming to these figures, so we'll do a lot of that through these videos. But I thought to start off the process, I would introduce you to a book that I think is just really the best introduction I've come across to helping you understand the Church Fathers. And so Robert Louis Wilken, who's an American patristic scholar, wrote a book called The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, which I think is just a really excellent introduction to the Church Fathers. And what he really emphasizes in that book is precisely this idea we started with of looking at them not as academics in a particular discipline of theology, but rather as people who were integrating their thought about and their work on theology in the life of the church. So it's really inseparable from their work as bishops, their reading of Scripture, their living out of their faith, and the faith of the church of their times, right? And so Wilken does a wonderful job, I think, of showing how this theology that these figures develop is really interconnected with their living faith. And so I'm going to ask you to read a chapter from his book. And when you have the time, I would highly recommend that you get the book and read the whole thing, because I think it's just wonderful. So we're going to start off by reading that, and then I will post on Blackboard some questions for you based on that chapter from the book. I'm really asking you to ask the critical questions about Wilken and his book that you ought to be asking about all the different texts you encounter in a graduate program. Now, as I said, I think Wilken's book is wonderful, but in anything we read, I think it's helpful to think about some of the questions about who's the audience, what's this author trying to achieve, how does he do it, is he successful? And so we're going to practice that on this chapter from Wilken, both as a way to get started, thinking about how the fathers work and getting Wilken's insights into that, and also as a way to kind of ease us into this practice for applying those same sorts of skills and questions to figures like Athanasius and Augustine. So we're going to start with somebody who's writing in English in our own time as a way to get our feet wet, so to speak. So I'm going to ask you about that on Blackboard. Also then, when you're done watching this video, and then if you go and read Wilken and post about, in response to the questions I put on Blackboard, I'm also going to ask you there on Blackboard about your own questions, your own concerns, your own enthusiasm in looking at the prospects for this class, right? Because I know for many people this might be very exciting. You maybe wanted to read these figures for a long time. Others of you might have particular hesitations or concerns, and so I think it's helpful for us to discuss that at the start of the class. What's our goal? What problems might we have? What concerns? And so I want to make sure that we can address as many concerns or questions as we can, And then also just gives me a better sense of what you are all looking to get out of this process, so that I can make sure that as much as possible we can shape our conversation over the course of the class to make sure that we're addressing the questions and concerns and interests that you have in looking at these figures and studying their thought. So that's how we're going to be starting off this first module and in this first week of our discussion in the class. Then, if you're really itching to jump in and really get started, and you work through that Wilkin book and or the chapter from the Wilkin book rather, and those other questions on the blackboard, for next time you can be looking forward to, we're going to jump right into the life of Athanasius and the thought of Athanasius. So I'm going to go ahead and post on Blackboard as well for Module 2 some links to some different resources for getting a little sense of who Athanasius was. So there's an address that was given by Pope Benedict talking about Athanasius. He did a whole series on Fathers of the Church, and so he did one on Athanasius that I think is really nice and emphasizes some of the key things about Athanasius that we're going to be focusing on. So that would be there. I'm also going to post a link to an online resource called the Catholic Encyclopedia, and that was an encyclopedia that is in the public domain because it was written in 1912, I believe. So some of it's a little dated. There are places where the scholarship has developed a bit since then, in the past 100 years or so. But in many cases, it's a really nice reference work if you're looking for a basic background on different topics in church thinking and church history, as long as you recognize that it's 100 years old. So some things have developed. So I'll give you a link to that article on Athanasius from there. And then we're going to be looking at, starting off with Athanasius' Life of Anthony. And so I will post on Blackboard an excerpt from a modern translation of the Life of Anthony for us to all look at, to introduce you to what he's doing there. And of course I will talk about it in the next module. We'll set the stage for you, if you will. But if you really want to jump ahead and get going, you can read some of this background material on Athanasius and take a look at the reading. And I'll also put up a link on the same side of the encyclopedia where you can find a translation of the entire Life of Anthony that is also free and in the public domain. So you can go ahead and take a look at that if you're interested. So that pretty much covers what I want to make sure that we address in this opening module. I don't want to get into a whole lot of the nitty-gritty details of the history and context of the different works or figures just yet. I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to be aiming to do in this class. So if you go on Blackboard and find that excerpt from Wilkin, read that, and start posting your response to the discussion questions I put up there, you will be off to a good start, and then you can look forward to tackling Athanasius next time. So I just want to make sure, if you have any questions, always feel free to let me know. I'm happy to answer questions via email, or you can call the office and leave a message if I'm not available. If you check the syllabus on the Blackboard site, you can find office hours when I should be in the office and able to answer the phone if I'm not with someone. For those of you who are local, you should always feel free to come by the office, and I'm happy to chat with you, although it might be good to email or call if it's going to be much of a trip, just to make sure I don't miss you. But I really do want to, in this first class, give you a good sense of how theology works, right? To look at these figures as a way of thinking about how we as theologians, right? Because in graduate program, you are entering into the craft. You're not just students anymore. This is part of that apprenticeship, right? That's becoming a theologian in your own stead, and using these figures as models, right? And to really think about how do they translate, how does their work, how does their thought, how do their methods translate into our real lives, right? Because the ultimate goal of this program is not just to learn a bunch of historical data about figures centuries and centuries ago, right? This is all aimed towards, again, supplementing, improving, enhancing our lives as Christians, contributing to the ongoing life of the church in our own day. And I want us to see these figures, right, who we often see depicted as these glowing icons, in the case of these figures, literally. We see them as icons. But we need to recognize that these were real men, right, who were living in real nitty-gritty circumstances and dealing with real heated fights and controversies. And to see them in that way and think about how they responded to those situations, and then how might their methods, how might their responses inform our own in this day that we live in today. And so feel free to bring in issues from our own time that you think connect with and are relevant to these discussions. And so in addition to the module discussions that are kind of the regular assignments for the course, there's also the Ask the Professor discussion forum on Blackboard. And so if you have broader topics in theology or things that don't quite fit with the discussion for the module, feel free to bring those up and bring those in as well. Again, this is online for the most part, and I understand that we all need this as a way of dealing with education in the hectic, technology-driven world that we live in today. But as much as possible, we want to make this like a traditional graduate program experience, right? And so a lot of the best conversations don't necessarily happen in the classroom, or in our case, the official discussion board. A lot of those discussions happen in the hall or after class. And so we have this, we have the weekends for those of you who are able to attend, but we also have this Ask the Professor forum as a place where we can have related theological discussions that maybe don't fit into the context of the regular assigned questions. So feel free to post things there. And of course, if you have particular questions about how things work, you can post them there, or feel free to email me or call me individually. So I'm very excited to be starting this program with you, starting this class with you. Don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward very much to hearing your thoughts on things as we get started in the discussion forum. Thanks.